as U.S. President-elect Joe Biden will lead the 46th administration after his confirmed by Congress. This comes after violent protesters supporting President Donald Trump stormed the U.S. Capitol on Wednesday in an attempt to stop lawmakers from finalizing the electoral process for the incoming president. Joining us to make sense of the events that led to the process finalization is Devin Barrington-Ward, who is the former candidate for the Georgia State Senate and managing director of the Black Futurist Group. And also expected to join us a little later is Dr. Keith Jennings from the African American Center for Global Politics and Human Rights. But for now, let's welcome Devin Barrington-Ward. Very good morning to you. Thank you for your time. We in South Africa watched at the chaos unfolding through the videos and some pictures, really looking at devastating scenes. Give us a sense of your observation on that end and what you made of everything that happened.
Well, prior to relocating back to Atlanta, I actually lived in Washington, D.C. and worked for the local city government there, which typically works in conjunction with the federal government for these type of events. The fact of the matter is that the authorities knew that this mass demonstration was going to be occurring. Authorities knew that the president had been inciting many of the factions that were in and represented at that mass demonstration. People like the Proud Boys, people like who are open with their white supremacy, gun right advocates and others, and knew that they were planning to become violent. And the fact of the matter is that it was a colossal failure on the part of the United States government to protect the nation's capital. And I find it very ironic, as also a frontline movement for Black Lives protester, that they were the position and how they were prepared for protesters over the summer who were protesting the death of George Floyd and the deaths of Breonna Taylor and other Black people gunned down and killed by law enforcement, that there was a completely different strength posture that was situated by the federal government. We saw police in riot gear, we saw tanks, we saw National Guard members, we saw members of the Army, we saw military helicopters and tanks and equipment, and none of those things, none of those resources and assets were used to protect the nation's capital. And so this is a direct result of us not taking white supremacy in this country serious. This is a direct result of the fact that we continue to have a two systems tiered of justice, where law enforcement is very aggressive with Black protesters, but essentially allows a mob to walk right through the front door because they are white and they are moving in association with the President of the United States. Another thing that is very interesting is that the president most certainly should be charged for treason, and that members of Congress should be working to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove him from office. The fact of the matter is that months ago, during a presidential debate, he also incited this violence when he said to the Proud Boys to stand by and stand back. And that's exactly what they did. And they stood by and stood back and waited to see the results of a lawful election where the president lost, and they attempted to overthrow an election while members of Congress on both sides of the aisle were supposed to be ratifying the decision made by the electorate across this country. And all of this is a direct correlation with how this country has a lack and the inability to deal with racism and white supremacy. And now, as Malcolm X has said, the chickens are coming home to roost. And so it is up to this upcoming administration to figure out how they're going to work with all of us to move the country forward.
Expectations with moving the country forward and dealing with these very serious issues that you've just raised?
Well, I have expectations because I know that I will be involved in the process. I know that many community organizers across the country will be involved in making sure that we hold this new administration and this new Congress accountable. The power of the people is what will ensure our success here in the United States. Here in Georgia, we recently elected 2 new U.S. senators, which have allowed the Democrats to retain the majority in the Senate. And so this is the opportunity to push forward with a progressive agenda. But progress cannot advance if we are not serious about holding those who engaged in treasonous acts accountable. What we do not want to see is for this administration, the new administration, to give the previous administration a pass. We want people held accountable to the full extent of the law, because we know if these were Black protesters, they wouldn't have even been able to make it up to the front door, much less pose for pictures in the speaker's office and ensue chaos inside the seat of government for the United States.
You say you want people to be held accountable, and we know that Donald Trump, for the first time, promised a smooth transition to Joe Biden and acknowledged that his presidency was ending as all the calls grew for his removal. What sort of action would you like to see being held against Donald Trump?
Well, we know there are numerous investigations that are occurring right now. There are federal authorities, including the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, that is looking into the activities that led up to the actual riot at the U.S. Capitol, and that would include the president. And I would say to lawmakers and all of the other individuals who are responsible for prosecution that the president is not above reproach, and that the president is not above the law, and that we cannot continue to send a signal to the country that white people adhere to different rules and laws than everyone else. Because if this was President Obama, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. He would have already been removed from public office, and we would be moving on into the new administration and having an acting president serve as a substitute, so to speak, until the new administration was sworn into office. And so the fact of the matter is that I encourage authorities to continue to move forward these investigations. There are also investigations taking place here in Georgia because he tried to shake down a state elections official to fine him, quote unquote, 11,780 votes to interfere with a free and fair election. And so our district attorney, our new district attorney here in the Atlanta area of Georgia, is looking into possible charges against the president. And there are also investigations taking place in New York around the president's shady business deals. Again, this is what happens when we have a criminal legal system that has a two-tiered system of justice, where people who engage in harm, like Donald Trump, continue to move forward without recourse. And now is the time. This is the moment where we must put our foot down, where we must draw a line in the sand, where we must say enough is enough, and we must stand on what this country is supposedly founded on. I cannot believe that the law and order president, quote unquote, has engaged in so much disorder, and that the authorities are still allowing him to retain the title of president of the United States. Something has to be done, and I hope that the investigations that are currently being engaged in are moved forward without reproach, and move forward with expediency to hold the president and his co-conspirators in Congress accountable. There are members of the House of Representatives, there are members of the United States Senate that contributed to this riot, contributed to the potential overthrowing of the United States government. If it was not for if it was not for brave congressional staffers, if it wasn't for many of the folks who were first responders, the government could have indeed fallen by a mass mob, a mob of mostly white men, incited by the seated president of the United States, who lost an election an election that was free and fair. And the fact of the matter is that this attack and assault on democracy cannot stand.
Devin, you mentioned some really important aspects as you were speaking here, speaking about the issue of racism, speaking about how things would have been different under President Barack Obama, and also speaking about the power behind the white nationalists in the US. And we know that, of course, racism in itself isn't unique to the US on its own, but South Africa also facing its own challenges. What are your expectations under Joe Biden when it comes to tackling the issue of racism?
Well, the expectation that I have is for this administration to move boldly with the recommendations that organizations like the Movement for Black Lives have provided, which is to move forward with the Breathe Act. The Breathe Act is legislation that the Movement for Black Lives supports, that we are demanding that members of the United States Senate and the House of Representatives take up as serious legislation, because this is the process where we start to reconcile some of the wrongs here in the United States, that we reconcile our history of slavery and Jim Crow, that we reconcile our systems of economic disparities that continue to persist in Black and Brown communities, that we reconcile that there was a clear difference that was displayed for the world to see, that white people are treated differently when they are engaging in some of the highest crimes in the land than Black people who are driving home, Black people who are sleeping in their bed, Black people who are texting on their phone, Black people who are just living, have been killed for much less. And so I am a champion of legislation like the Breathe Act that seeks to divest money from traditional law enforcement, that seeks to divest money from court systems and prisons and jails, and invest that money into Black and Brown communities as a means of public safety, because I recognize that there will not be public safety through the expansion of the criminal legal system, but that there will be public safety through the expansion of investments into people and investments in communities over cages. And so I think that the Biden administration has very clear marching orders. Many of the folks who are out organizing to demilitarize local police, that were out organizing to ensure that resources aren't tied up in the criminal legal system and are actually distributed in communities in a way that is equitable and helps build wealth and health and safety. We recognize that those type of policies have to be fast-tracked in this moment, because again, we have seen that treason is colluding with white supremacy and that they go hand in hand. And so many of these officials are officials who were mayors, who were governors, who have gone to Congress now and are colluding with the President of the United States to overthrow a fair and clear election. And so we have to see that as a signal that we continue to allow unabashed white privilege and white supremacy in this country to almost to the point of our downfall. And so this is a moment where now the Biden administration has the opportunity to listen to the voices of people like myself and others who are working directly in Black communities to bring more equity and clarity to the United States, and also to go through a truth and reconciliation process that recognizes the history and the harm that the United States has done, because this is a direct relation to the miseducation of Americans, because we continue to whitewash history and not tell it like it is, and come up with alternative narratives and alternative facts for what has really happened. And now white people in this country feel entitled, the arrogance that they walked inside of the US Capitol almost like they knew nothing was going to happen to them. And so this is the moment where we have to really listen to what is happening, see what is happening, and listen to the voices of Black and Brown people who have been screaming this for years.
Very well. Thank you so much for your input and that insight. Devin Barrington Ward, former candidate for Georgia State Senate and Managing Director of the Black Futurist Groups. We continued with this discussion, bringing in Dr. Keith Jennings from the African American Center for Global Politics and Human Rights. A very good morning to you. Thank you for your time. We saw chaos unfolding there as the calls mount now for the removal of President Donald Trump. What did you make of the political dynamics as we saw this chaos unfolding?
Well, there's several things that we should really focus on. This was a incitement to insurrection, and the attack on the U.S. Capitol was an attack on the United States of America. It wasn't from external forces that the U.S. is very prepared to address. It was from the internal issues, from the highest office in the land. And the response, I think, has been swift, that you cannot trust this person. If Twitter has put him off of their account on Facebook, you can't trust him with the nuclear codes. The second point is as your previous guest was pointing out, the disparity is clear. In fact, we don't have to, there's no conjecture here. The way that they responded to Black Lives Matter protests in the past compared to police opening gates, allowing them to ransack offices within the Capitol, and to put in harm's way the leadership of the United States Congress. And to interfere with a process that in this political system that seemed to be sacred. So these are the main issues. The resignations from the Secretary for Transportation and now Education, many people within the White House. Although we disagree politically with them, the fact is that this has crossed a line. And the idea that a president might be impeached for a second time, or that the 25th Amendment, Section 4 of it, that says this person is not well to carry out the duties of the office. This shows you that there's a crisis right now within our democratic system, and it has to be resolved, and it needs to be resolved soon. Otherwise, we could end up in war with a country, or these crazy
Dr.
ideas
Jennings,
about
as we continue our conversation in a short while, we will, of course, continue this conversation, of course, with Dr. Keith Jennings, President of African American Center for Global Politics and Human Rights, shortly after this. Welcome back. We continue our conversation with Dr. Keith Jennings from the African American Center for Global Politics and Human Rights as we talk about the impact of the chaos that we saw unfolding in the U.S., the Capitol siege by white nationalists. Dr. Jennings, you were speaking about the disparities here, the differences, looking at what happened and the response from police with the Black Lives Matter compared to what we saw taking place here with the white nationalists, and really just speaking to the big differences. What do you think now this matter speaks to as you go into a Joe Biden presidency and the pressing matters of racism that need to be urgently addressed?
Well, the poverty and inequality in this country is woven into the system. And so there needs to be structural changes. The systemic racism is what this country was built on, the enslavement of African descendants and the genocide against indigenous peoples. And that's enshrined in the Constitution. That's not just my opinion. The way that taxation and representation in the first United States Congress was decided is Article 1, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. But again, the disparities are only one aspect of what we saw the other day. This was a fundamental attack on the democratic process. The reason they stormed the Capitol was to keep Biden from being confirmed. And now that he is, the expectations ought not be more than where we are. Donald Trump received 74 million votes. That's a lot of people. It's the second largest number of votes that any candidate for president has ever received. Luckily, Biden received 81 million. But it shows that the country is divided. The U.S. Senate now is 50 seats on either side. So passing policy that is relevant to pro-poor policy that's relevant to the needs of the population versus those like McConnell, who would put liability of corporations ahead of providing some sustenance relief to people for this COVID-19 pandemic that we are experiencing right now. These are the policy choices before us. Here in Georgia, we were lucky to be able to win both U.S. Senate seats so that now Biden has a chance. He has a governing coalition. The coalition previously was one to get him elected, but now he and Harris can govern. They can make sure that people have access to health care. Maybe we'll get the George Floyd policing bill passed, and we'll get a new Voting Rights Act because these are the fundamental issues that are before the country right now. And we have a choice. I'm not sure which direction we're going to go in. I know that there are those like myself and others who are pushing for a more perfect union. But this is a critical moment right now for the country, and how we respond to what this man, who's a sick person, has just done is a big part of where we will go. So the next few days in this country are not only important for the future of it, but for the future of the world.
We know that some processes, legal processes, are already underway when it comes to Donald Trump. But in your mind, what sort of accountability would be required to perhaps steer the U.S. forward?
Well, there are only three real options available right now. One is a censure, and censoring him right now is almost meaningless. The impeachment process would take a long time, but it can be started, and he would be on record, and that will be a stain against his legacy. And quite frankly, if it is concluded, he will be prevented from ever holding office again, because that is a measure that could be there. The other measure is to invoke the 25th Amendment, and that is to get the majority of his cabinet to say that he's unable to fulfill the duties. That's unlikely, too, because several, I think at least 4 people within his cabinet are acting, and acting people can't participate in that process. And now with these resignations of the Secretary of Education and the Secretary of Transportation, again, it's unlikely. So we're really in a mess, and I can't stress it how dangerous this moment is. It should not be underestimated.
And you know, with the dangers of the process and what's happening now, we know that a short while ago, our guest Devin Barrington-Ward spoke about how this situation now presents an opportunity for Joe Biden to begin to listen to the voices of those who have been suppressed, and also recognize the history and the harm that's been done. You know, when it comes to the work that lies ahead for Joe Biden, what would be an advantage for his administration in terms of listening to the voices of those who've been oppressed and suppressed?
Well, I think he has to, because this is a moment of reckoning. I agree with your previous guest. And Biden and Harris have an opportunity to move their agenda forward now because they have that governing margin. And Harris will be the tiebreaker within the U.S. Senate. It's still going to be difficult because even everyone within the Democratic caucus doesn't agree on everything. But on the essentials, we need an infrastructural bill so that because the infrastructure of this country is crumbling, and that will provide jobs for people. We need to make sure that people have health care and that Obamacare is maintained. Because, quite frankly, if it's not maintained, we have, as you know the figures, 20 million people have contracted the coronavirus here in this country. That is now a pre-existing condition. And if that is lost, you have, again, a massive failure of public policy. And it's disproportionately impacting African Americans and Latinos and indigenous peoples. And you look at the city like Los Angeles, which is the second largest city in this country. What's happening there is unimaginable. And this is not me saying what our expectations are compared to countries that don't have resources. I'm saying that just in terms of a human response to a crisis. So Biden really doesn't have a lot of choices but to respond to the crisis that exists in the social and the economic sphere. But what we're dealing with right now is mainly a political crisis and the failure of leadership and the harm that has been done. The damage that could be done, and whether or not we want to place our trust in someone who's shown that he is unfit for leadership. And that's been known to black and brown people before he got into office. But since he's been here, everyone knows he's a racist, and he doesn't hide his contempt. He vetoed the defense bill because he didn't want to change the name of bases that are named after Confederate generals. When you saw those people going in that Capitol, they were carrying Confederate flags. And when you look at them, these are some of the same people who were in Charlottesville, Virginia, saying that they will not be replaced.
Dr. Keith Jennings, unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'm going to have to cut you off there. Thank you so much for sharing your views and that insight, Dr. Keith Jennings from the African American Center for Global Politics.